Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you this evening. Thank you for being here on this Wednesday night as we gather together for Bible study. We're studying the works of the flesh from Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, as you see there on the screen. And what we want to do is make sure we have a great handle on the meaning of these terms. Every one of these things can keep us out of heaven, will keep us out of heaven. And so we need to very much understand the meaning of all the terms listed here as works of the flesh. We started out, the first lesson was about adultery and fornication. Last week, Monty taught the lesson about lasciviousness. He actually got ahead of us. The lesson about lasciviousness was actually the third lesson in the series, and Monty jumped ahead. And I saw part of that on YouTube. He did an excellent job. And I'm glad he got to talk about that. I think it's so important to understand the meaning of lasciviousness. Lasciviousness covers so much of the kinds of sins that are extremely prevalent in our world today. And so I was glad Monty got a chance to address the subject of lasciviousness. We're going to back up now and catch the second lesson. If you're looking at the study guide, the second lesson is about uncleanness. And so we're going to talk about that one tonight. So we will have had fornication, lasciviousness, and uncleanness. And that being the case, then Lord willing, we'll be ready for the fourth lesson next week. Here are four different translations of Galatians 5:19. The works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness. And in all of this, in all of our discussion, we're going to be following the King James wording, and we're going to be following the King James order listing of these works of the flesh. So our lesson tonight is about uncleanness, but I want you to notice that the other translations referenced here, and maybe others that you're looking at, all use the word impurity. And I think we will see why when we look to the meaning of the words that are translated. And so here's some definitions from authorities. Strong's says that this word is from I was saying this right earlier. Akatharsia. And he says the meaning is impurity, the quality of impurity, and it can refer to physical impurity. In other words, this is a person who's just dirty. He's just filthy. Or it can be used to describe moral uncleanness. He says it is from the A here is a negative participle. And so the word is a two-part word. You put this A at the front of this Greek word kathartos, akathartos. It turns that into a negative. And so kathartos would be clean. Akathartos is not clean. He says it has meaning of impure, ceremonially, morally, foul, unclean. You're beginning to get the idea of the meaning of the word here. I like the way Vine has it though. Akatharsi denotes uncleanness. It is used of physical uncleanness. He gives a reference in Matthew 23:27 that we're going to be looking at. I thought this was real interesting. Notice what he says right here. Instances in the papyri. In other words, ancient secular writings. And so a lot of times when they're doing word studies, what they want to do is they want to find how the word was used not just in the biblical text, how was the word used in other writings of the period. And he says, instances in the papyri speak of tenants keeping houses in good condition. So a person who was clean, this katharsia, would be a word that you would use about someone who keeps their house just real neat and clean. You know, we all know people like that. Their houses are just spotless. They always are. You never go there and find their house in disarray. Their houses are just spotless. You would use this word to describe that. You put the letter A in front of that, it turns it to a negative. A person whose house is not neat and clean. A person whose house is just filthy. And we've seen situations like that too, right? And so he says that in the secular writings of the day, you would find instances like that where the word would be used that way. And so he says here that it can be used, the word can be used of physical uncleanness or moral uncleanness. He says that our text is an example of it being used of moral uncleanness. But I think a good sort of mental image of this is to picture in your mind somebody whose house is just horrible. Just, you hear in the news sometimes about, somebody in their house is just, they haven't even carried the garbage out in months. And the place, the workers have to actually wear a gas mask in order to go in there. It's so filthy. So if you can imagine that, get that mental picture in your mind, and then turn that to a moral application. People whose moral lives are just so horribly nasty, filthy. That's the idea of this word. It's not a mild word. It's not something, just a little bit. It's just a little problem here, a little problem there. No, this is extreme filthiness. And when it's used in the moral sense, it's used of extreme moral filthiness. And so I think a good working definition for us here is moral dirtiness or impurity. But I want to stress to you, it's the idea of extreme case. By the nature of the word used. Any thoughts or comments here? All right. So what we're going to do, and we'll try to do this in all of our lessons, is we're just going to go through and look at places. Hopefully, in most of the lessons, our intention is to look at every place the word is used in the New Testament so that we can get a really good handle on the meaning of the word and its application. So we'll just go Matthew through Revelation. Every lesson we'll just try to start at Matthew and chase the word all the way through to Revelation wherever we find it. In Matthew 23:27, you should remember probably Matthew 23 is where Jesus was condemning the scribes and Pharisees. He called them repeatedly, he called them hypocrites. That's a rather famous text in Matthew 23 where Jesus did that just over and over again. And this was near the end of that discussion. He says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness." Well, there's the word. And here, this would be a case of the word being used of physical uncleanness. If you can imagine, now remember, the Jews did no form of embalming. And that's why they very, very rapidly buried their dead. Because a dead human body begins to stink after just a few hours. I mean, literally just a few hours, not very many hours. A human body begins to decompose to the point of actually emitting a foul smell, the death, every once in a while, you smell a dead animal or something, just that dead smell. And so the Jews buried their dead quickly. Now, remember also that under the law of Moses, you became ceremonially unclean if you had contact with a dead body. So you didn't want to accidentally come into contact with a dead body. Sometimes you have to. If it's your dead family member, then you have to prepare the body and put them in the tomb, put them in the sepulcher. And so you would unavoidably come into contact with the dead body. You've got to go through a process of purification. So you don't want to do that accidentally. If you have to, you have to, but otherwise you try to avoid that. And so what the Jews would do is that they would bury the dead body in the tomb or sepulcher. Usually that wasn't just a one-person thing. That was usually a tomb or a sepulcher, maybe where a whole family or even associated relatives would be buried, depending on the size of the sepulcher. Sometimes they buried in natural caves. Other times, like the tomb where Jesus was buried, it was a tomb that had been hewn out of a solid rock bluff. And so it was a solid rock that they had just chiseled away to make a cavity or a room where they could bury people. So you put the dead body in there, and then you seal it up. You put a rock or a stone in front of it. But so that nobody will enter without knowingly entered, what they did is that they would whitewash the entrance to the tomb or the sepulcher. The whitewashing was intended as a warning. Don't go in here unless you mean to go in here. But what it did was made it look nice on the outside. The tomb looks nice on the outside. It's all been whitewashed. So it looks nice on the outside, but inside are rotting corpses. Inside are dead men's bones. I mean, you can't hardly think of anything more foul or horribly smelly or nasty than a body that has decomposed for some time. And this sepulchre or tomb would be full of dead men's bones. And so Jesus is saying that he's making a point that these hypocritical scribes and Pharisees were like those tombs. They looked nice on the outside, but inwardly they were rotten, disgusting, foul-smelling like a dead body. And so Jesus is using a really powerful word picture there to describe what these people were like. But in this case, the word uncleanness, he would be using the word here in the sense of something physically unclean, because he's talking about literally dead men's bones and rotted corpses, the uncleanness associated with that. But I think what's interesting here is if we are hypocritical, that's how we appear to God. That's how He thinks of us. If we are making a pretense of our religion, and if we're not really living pure moral lives, God sees us like a hole full of rotting corpses. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, we really need to sense that, because I think we tend to downplay evil. Oh yeah, it's bad, but it's not all that bad. I probably shouldn't do that. I need to get over that. I should quit doing that. But I'm not all that upset about it, and I'm not strongly motivated to quit doing the immoral things that I'm doing. If I knew how God viewed it, I think I would be more strongly motivated, don't you? So that's the idea. Get the picture here. Thoughts or comments? Anybody? Monty?
When we think of this word uncleanness and even this idea of this crypt being full of dead men's bones and the rotten putrefaction, I think of the word abomination. And that word has the idea of it's something that's just so disgusting it makes you want to throw up when you see it. And God talks about various sins throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament. They're an abomination to Him. And so God looks at our sins and it's something that's disgusting to Him to the point it would make Him want to throw up if He was a physical being. And so we've got to learn to look at sin that same way instead of it being a temptation to us. We've got to learn to look at it, this is nasty and I don't want nothing to do with it. Just like we would a corpse with a tomb with rotting corpses in it. We wouldn't want to go in there and play around. Yeah. It's nasty, it stinks, I don't want nothing to do with it.
Yeah. So I think you're right, and I think that's why we want to develop this mental image to help motivate us to stay away from these impure things. I think you're exactly right. All right, Romans 1, verse 24. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness. Here's our word. God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Then it goes on so he talks about how they were dishonoring their bodies between themselves. And then he goes on to describe what was taking place, and it's homosexuality, right? He says, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. All right, so here, there's no doubt that the word uncleanness in this text has to do with moral uncleanness, and it is in the context of a discussion about homosexuality. So, a couple of things. God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts. So, uncleanness, moral impurity, where does it start? It starts in the heart, right? It starts in the heart, and then it leads to what we do with our bodies. We've tried to stress this so often. I think it's so very, very important that this is why we've got to control our thinking processes. We've got to control what we allow ourselves to think about. Because it is just absolutely undeniably true that if we think on something and we continue to think on something, it will lead to us acting upon that which we've been thinking about. Thoughts precede actions, we always say. And that is just absolutely true. So notice, God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts. What did that lead to? Well, it led to them acting out in homosexual ways. And so the uncleanness it begins in the heart and ultimately is manifested with physical actions of the body. Any thoughts on that? I think it's interesting that these first three words that we are discussing here, fornication, uncleanness, and lasciviousness, these are all associated with sensuality, right? With primarily sins of a sexual nature. And in our world where that is downplayed and where people act like it's insignificant and unimportant what one does sexually, what you think about or what you do sexually, it's very important to see that in the very initial words here, in these listings of works of the flesh, we see that it's really important. We got to get our minds to an understanding of how much this is a repulsive thing to God. This is a really important and familiar text to us in Romans chapter 1. I think probably, certainly in the New Testament, I don't think there's any clearer or plainer description of homosexuality than here in Romans chapter 1. And it's associated with and probably initiated with uncleanness in the heart. All right, Romans 6, verse 19. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as ye have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. So here Paul is describing the former state of these Christians in Rome. The book of Romans obviously written to Christians in Rome. Previously they had yielded their members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity. I think that's kind of interesting so that there is this uncleanness and it manifests itself. Another word for iniquity, of course, is sin. So the uncleanness led to sin and more sin. I think we can take from that a point that we sometimes stress is that one sin leads to another. And if we allow ourselves to be morally impure, then that will cause us to sin. And more likely it'll cause us to do additional sin, lead to additional sins. So there's a progression. Sin leads to sin. Sin begets sin. And it just goes from bad to worse. The classic, I think, Bible example of that is King David with Bathsheba. He looked, he lusted, he committed adultery, he lied, he caused a man to be drunken. He eventually murdered that man and tried to cover it up with lies. Sin begetting sin, sin leading to sin. And it all was moral impurity on the part of David. One thing led to another. So he says to these Christians, that's the way you were. Now, he says, yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. And so he said, just change that 180 degrees, flip that around the other direction. And instead of letting uncleanness reign in your mind, leading you to all kinds of sin, let righteousness reign in your life, leading you to live a holy life. And really, that's the way it should be for those of us who are trying to serve God. I'm afraid that we have too much access in the world. We are too knowledgeable about the kind of sins that take place in the world. And probably we allow ourselves to be led to think about the sins of the world when what we ought to be doing is yielding our members servants to righteousness and holiness. We need to live holy lives. Any thoughts or comments here from anybody? All right, just keep progressing then. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 21. Paul says, "And lest when I come again, my God will humble me among you, and that I shall bewail many which have sinned already, and have not repented of the uncleanness and fornication and lasciviousness which they have committed." Well, here's all three words, our first three words, right? Fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness. And Paul was afraid that when he came to Corinth, he would find situations where people were guilty of these sins and had not repented of them. That was going to be a very troubling thing to the Apostle Paul. He obviously cared deeply about these Christians. He had worked and labored there. This is a church we know that has had historically just lots of problems. But the problems weren't just that they were bickering and fighting with one another. They were doing that. But the problems also involved the fact that they were people there engaged in sinful activities, sensual and sexual sins of immorality. And he was afraid that when he came there, he would find that there were people still engaged in that sort of thing. Don't you think it's a curiosity? Why would Christians continue to make a pretense of Christianity if they're going to engage in uncleanness, fornication, and lasciviousness? I'm not sure we have the answer to that, but it's not an uncommon thing that a person will still try to make a show of religion, but in reality their lives are completely not right. Monty?
In that time frame, I could see that he was condemning them a lot for bringing the Judaizing teachers, was bringing Judaism into the church. I have to believe that, especially like here in Corinth, where there was a lot of pagan influence in the idol temples, and we know those kind of things took place as acts of worship there, it's probably reasonable to expect that the people that came out of that was trying to bring that kind of thing over in there too. And so I think that's why Paul was having to preach to you. They had done it in the past, and it was supposed to be a good thing, a worship thing, and now they haven't really grasped it in their mind that it's not a worship thing. I think in our culture, we're so overwhelmed and inundated with these kinds of things in the world around us. We see it everywhere we go. That in our minds, it's hard for people to grasp that this. I see it everywhere, but I'm not supposed to.
Yeah.
And so it's easy for us to participate in it, I think, and think, well, God will understand. God will love you. God, a lot of people, I've heard people say that before. They talk about spending the weekend with their girlfriend, and then went to church on Sunday. And I said, well, I thought you were supposed to be a Christian. Well, God understands. He made me this way. Well, God also made me and gave me commands to control myself and contain myself. That's what He understands.
I think that's exactly right. As you were saying that, Monty, I was thinking, we tend to think that we live in, it's easy to imagine that we live in the worst of all possible times. And when it comes to these matters of morality, that it's worse now than it ever was before. And the fact of the matter is, although it's very bad, we're not excusing the present age at all. At least we don't have people in Columbia, Tennessee, who have a temple down here, and they have prostitutes serving in the temple and engaging in fornication and lasciviousness and uncleanness and calling it worship. We don't have that, at least. And so, we don't have to imagine that these are the worst of all possible times, but they're plenty bad enough. Wade?
I think Mike's right, but I think it is easier to do things that are socially acceptable, even though they may be sinful.
Yeah.
But everybody around you don't think it's sinful, and so they don't look on you badly because you do those things, but they could be sinful.
So the social taboo has been lifted. It's so common. You see it on the news. Sports figures, celebrities of one sort or another, and they're talking about so and so. Here's his girlfriend. They're expecting their second baby or something. And you say, what? Why aren't they married? But they still identified as his girlfriend or his fiance. His fiance is expecting their third baby. Well, that's the kind of immoral, unclean society that we live in. But it's not new. That's been a perpetual problem. Monty.
I remember as a young teenager, it was a big scandalous thing that Elizabeth Taylor had been married 4 times.
Yeah.
Now people are married 4, 5, or 6 times, and nobody thinks anything of it. It's just the way things are. So our culture has changed in that regard. As you say, the taboo, that was a big deal back then. You didn't get divorced and remarried because that was associated with evil. And now it's just what people do.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And really, I hope our young people will pay particular attention to how serious these sins are, because the world is telling you this is not that bad. It's not that serious. It's not. You really don't have to even think or worry about this sort of thing. You do have to worry about it if you want to please God and go to heaven. So I think it's especially important, young people, to pay attention to these words and their meanings. Let's look at Ephesians 4, verse 19. Ephesians 4:19, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. So there's uncleanness, there's lasciviousness from last week's lesson. And I think probably the most significant part of this verse is that you can become past feeling. You can engage in this kind of activity so much that now you don't have any pangs of conscience, for instance. So the first time you choose to do some immoral deed, to engage in some sexual immorality, the first time you do that, you can imagine that the conscience would just plague you. Oh man, what have I done? This is so serious. But if you keep engaging in that activity, I would use the term grow calloused to it. And I think the idea of a callousness is really interesting. So if you get out in the spring and you're working in the garden and you're shoveling and you're hoeing and you're raking and you work up a blister because your hands are soft and so you end up with a blister there. It hurts. But if you keep doing that, and so you work and this is your job. Maybe your job is to use a shovel and a rake and a hoe all the time. What happens is you develop calluses on your hand. It doesn't hurt anymore. Your hands become insensitive to that irritation. That can happen spiritually. We can engage in sinful activity. So we can engage in uncleanness, moral impurity so much that we get past feeling. We become insensitive to it. It doesn't bother us anymore. Our conscience, the scriptures talk about our conscience as becoming seared. And so we have a conscience, but it's not foolproof. Your conscience can be destroyed. Your conscience can be violated enough that eventually you engage in these sinful activities and it doesn't even bother you anymore. And so here is lasciviousness and uncleanness, and you can get past feeling to where it doesn't even bother you anymore. And we cannot afford to let that happen to us. So I would urge us all to stay morally sensitive to these kinds of things, and that moral sensitivity will keep us from doing those things and guide us away from that kind of conduct. Anybody? Thoughts, Monty?
I knew a guy one time who was discussing something in class sort of along this line and had to do a talk with watching movies that's got bad language or whatever in them. He said, all that kind of thing don't bother me. But he would qualify, I think, in this kind of person that was past feeling. This stuff shouldn't bother us. When we hear bad language, it should bother us. We see something that's inappropriate, it should bother us. But I think he was bragging. I think he thought it meant he was extra tough spiritually, but what it really meant he was extra weak spiritually.
Yeah, exactly right. There's no sign of strength there. And I'm like, I've heard people say, for instance, that they can go to a swimming pool or a place where there's mixed bathing. And I've heard guys say that they can see a girl dressed in a skimpy two-piece swimming suit and it doesn't bother them at all. And what I want to say to them is, either you're lying or you need to go to the doctor because there's something wrong. That's supposed to bother you. That's the reason why in the modern world women dress like that. They intend to bother those who see them. And so if we become past feeling, that's not a good thing. That's a very serious thing, right? So don't let yourself get past feeling. All right, Ephesians 5, verse 3. And we looked at this verse when we were talking about fornication. Notice there's fornication and there's uncleanness. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints. I don't think we have to go too much into this, but remember this expression, becometh. We ought to be living and setting such an example that it makes Christianity look good. In other words, somebody knows you. They know you're a Christian. And they say, that guy, he's a really fine person. I'm really impressed with that. I'm impressed with what a good Christian he is. It makes me want to be like that myself. That's conducting yourself in a way that's becoming to Christianity, becoming to the saints, to those of us who call ourselves Christians. What we don't want to do is act in such a way that is unbecoming to Christianity. Someone sees us, they know how we act, they know the kind of things that we do, and they say, that guy calls himself a Christian. But man, I know all kinds of bad stuff he does. That's not becoming, right? And so here in this verse, the two things mentioned that are unbecoming to Christians, fornication and all forms of moral uncleanness, moral impurity. You know, obviously, this would be more specific than this. Fornication is a specific kind of moral sin, but this uncleanness, this moral impurity would cover a lot of territory, all kinds of moral impurity. And remember, keep trying to develop that mental view of this house that's so unkept and unclean that when the workers go in there, they have to wear a gas mask because they can't even breathe. I mean, it makes you sick to even breathe the air. And then imagine that our lives, inwardly, God would see us that way if we're guilty of uncleanness. All right, Colossians 3, verse 5. Again, this is several of these verses include all these same words. Here again is fornication, which we talked about. Mortify, therefore, your members which are upon the earth. Fornication, uncleanness. Here's our word this week. Fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Here's a word that we don't use too much, the word mortify. I'm pretty sure I could say without fear of contradiction that I've never used the word mortify in normal conversation. But we understand the word mortify means to put to death, put these things to death. You know, if we put them to death, then we don't reach back and try to bring them out again. We've died to these kind of things. We've put them to death. And so we're not just trying to hang on to just a little bit of these kinds of sins. We have put them to death, mortify, put to death these things. And among them, fornication and uncleanness. So hopefully we live so that others in the communities, especially others who are brothers and sisters in the local congregation, when they think of us, they don't think of this gross, sickening kind of uncleanness. I would hope that that's the case. But it may be that in our own heart of hearts, we know that we do harbor a degree of uncleanness, moral impurity. And that's the real test. Have we put it to death or not? It's not so much how well I can maybe deceive you into thinking that I'm morally pure. I might be able to pull that off, you know. I might be able to do a good job of deception so that you don't have any idea of the kind of things that I'm really involved in, or especially the things that go on in my mind, the kind of thoughts that I allow to race around in there. So the test is not ultimately what you see me do, although that's important. I'm not denying that. But on this business of mortifying these evil desires, this uncleanness, I need to be honest in my own heart and make sure that I have really ridded myself of these things, put them to death. That's the real test. Not what I think is going on in your heart, but what God knows is going on in your heart and vice versa. Right? Okay, thoughts or comments here? Anybody?
It seems really hard to be a Christian and to avoid these thoughts and these, not so much the practices, but when you talk about uncleanness, I know that when I'm with Christians, sometimes I'm a little bit harder on my brothers and sisters than maybe I would be a stranger.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes, you think, oh, I know this person, like what you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And I'm just I'm confessing my own uncleanness.
Well, I think there's two sides to that, Paul. One side is, I think you're right. I think we do tend to judge our own brethren harsher than others, But actually, there's a higher expectation. I have a higher expectation of my brother. If I meet a fellow on the street and we begin to discuss, I know he's a man of the world, he's been living after the manner of the world, then I understand where he's coming from, and I can really try to work with him and bring him along. Whereas if it's a brother or sister in Christ, I have a higher expectation of them, and I think they do of me, and that's not a bad thing. You know, that sort of accountability. I do think we want to be kind and not harsh in our judgments, but it's good to be held to a high standard, a high bar. And ultimately, the high bar is to get completely rid of that impurity out of our hearts and minds and our lives. So instead of having our mental house nasty and filthy, we want our mental, moral, spiritual house to be like that lady that I described earlier. Her house is always spotless, is always meticulously clean. That's what we want. That's what we want to be striving for. Good thoughts. 1 Thessalonians 2, beginning verse 1. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain, but even after we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile, but as we are allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. This is interesting because Paul's writing this, and we know the story. We know what happened to him at Philippi. Remember, at Philippi, he and Silas had been arrested. They were beaten, thrown in the dungeon. Were singing at midnight when there was the great earthquake. You remember how they converted the Philippian jailer. So that's the episode he's talking. When they left Philippi, they came to Thessalonica. So they had just been treated that way in Philippi, and they came to Thessalonica. But they began to preach again. And our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak. So, how would someone exhort, or we'd probably substitute the word preach, how would someone preach out of deceit and uncleanness and guile? How would you do that? Well, go ahead, Monty.
When I was younger, probably before I was a teenager, there was a preacher we had where I was growing up. And we come to find out later on that he wound up losing his preaching job because basically he was carousing with some of the women of the congregation. And so when we think of that somebody, they're preaching out of deceit or uncleanness or guile, they're doing it in order to provide for their own lust. They're not being honest about their motivation for preaching. They're being deceitful because they have unclean desires and dishonesty in their heart about their motivation for what they're doing. So we can see that, or we see false teachers today, especially these televangelists, and their deceit or their exhortation is so that they can get filthy rich today. It's obvious that's what their motivation is. And so we can see these kinds of things, and that's how somebody would be preaching out of deceit or uncleanness or God.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I was thinking along the same lines of these televangelists. Some of the young people will remember the names Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart. Those were back 35, 40 years ago. They were big name televangelists, and both of them were exposed for all kinds of deceit, financial deceit, moral uncleanness. Both those guys were exposed to have been very morally impure. And the word guile, of course, is closely associated with deceit. In other words, when they spoke, they didn't mean what they said. It was all pretense, and they were lying to get ahead. Paul said when we came to Thessalonica, that sort of thing, that was not us. And you know that. He says, for as we were allowed of God to be put in trust, notice this, put in trust with the gospel. That's why the Apostle Paul was so careful how he conducted himself. He believed that he had a personal trust, The gospel had been entrusted to him. We know that he had been specially chosen to be an apostle to the Gentiles. He felt like, God has entrusted me with this. I've got to be careful how I act, what I do and say. I've got to be careful how I live. I've got to live a pure life because I've been entrusted with the gospel. That's the way we need to feel. Now, we're not entrusted with the gospel in the same sense that Paul was. We're not inspired people like Paul was. But in a sense, we also are entrusted with the gospel. We know the truth of God. We have an urgent need to be communicating that gospel with the lost people of the world around us. And we will not be effective if they know that we are unclean people, morally impure people. You might as well keep your mouth shut. If you're going to live a morally impure life, don't try to influence others for Christ, because you will not be successful in the long run. All right. And then finally, we're just about out of time. That worked out pretty good. We get to this last verse. 1 Thessalonians 4, beginning verse 3. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor, not in the lust of concupiscence, even as the Gentiles which do not know God, that no man go beyond and defraud his brother in any matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we also have forewarned you and testified, for God hath not called us to uncleanness, but to holiness. So there's your contrast right there. I think this last one is a pretty good one to end on, because you see the contrast. What is uncleanness? It is the opposite of holiness. All right? You see it right there. So, and here's another text in which Paul is urging Christians of the first century to live morally pure lives, to not live as the Gentiles, that is, people of the world. Don't live like people of the world. God hasn't called us. I think this is really an important expression. God hath not called us. So we've received a calling from God. We've been called by the gospel. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 14 says, we've been called by the gospel. What have you been called to do? God didn't call you to live morally impure lives like the worldly people all around us. He didn't call you to live like that. He called you to live a holy life. So understand, what is your calling? We've been called to a higher plane. We've been called to a higher level. And we cannot excuse ourselves because of the moral impurity that surrounds us in our culture. And there's plenty of that, that's for sure. We cannot excuse ourselves and say, well, that's just the way the world is. And I guess I'm just doing as everybody else does. No. Regardless of what others do, God has called us. He didn't call us to uncleanness, but to holiness. All right. So there's our word uncleanness. So all three of these initial words, works of the flesh, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, they're all in the same direction. In some sense, they're almost redundant, but that just stresses how important this is for us to be really morally pure people. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll take lesson 4 next week, Lord willing.